I guess maybe just
There we go.
just to start with, a little bit of history about my family and myself. Um, my mother is the product of a broken home. Her father was an alcoholic, and her mother divorced her father when they were young, when my mom was a young adult. But back in the 1950s, that was a big shame. And my at the time, I just at times I thought my mom was just whacked. And but looking back on it now from the perspective of being 63, she was just a woman who was extremely damaged by her childhood. My dad, they were his family on my family on my father's side was they were German. They lived in a German settlement in Yugoslavia, Southeast Europe, in a little town outside a little town called Jabuka. Dad was born in 1928. And when he was 12 years old or so, the Germans had occupied that part of Europe, and they came into their town or village, and were taking the men into the German army. And he tells me he remembers for the men that refused to join, they were taken outside of town, and they heard gunfire, and they went out like the next day and found these men had been executed. My grandfather was taken into the German army as a cook. Shortly after that, things just got really crazy where they were. I mean, a lot of details that aren't really relevant to the narrative tonight, but my grandmother ended up in a labor camp. My dad spent a fair amount of World War II as a refugee, and he immigrated to the United States in 1951. My grandparents followed in 1953, and by God's grace, they all ended up in the same part of the country in Iowa, and the family was back together. My dad had a lot of issues, and it bled over on especially myself. I was the oldest, and my next youngest brother, Marty. Dad had a very violent and unpredictable temper, and when he would be displeased over, from my perspective, minor things, we were beaten. Because of that, as a young kid, I remained very distant and introverted. At least in some respects, I'm still somewhat introverted, but I just didn't get really emotionally attached to much of anything. I learned to keep my head down because I didn't want to be exposed to that abuse. As I've grown, and that made me very angry toward my dad and my mom too. But having lived life, I believe my dad was experienced post-traumatic stress syndrome and disorder, and the man had a lot of issues that he didn't really have any help for. Growing up, my grandparents were Roman Catholic, and they were bothered by on my dad's side, Grandma and Grandpa Egger. They were very devout Roman Catholic, and they were bothered that we weren't going to church, so they wanted us kids to go to church with them. You know, we had this whole mom, dad, in-law thing going on, and so instead of letting that happen, Mom went out and got us black pants, white shirt, and clip tie, and we went to the Methodist church. And I remember we didn't go often, but Dad would let me go when I wanted. And I remember in like 5th and 6th grade, I went to confirmation class and was confirmed and made a member of the Methodist Church. But and they were good people, but through all of that time, I was never confronted with the fact that I was lost. As I grew up, mostly in high school, I became aware that I could control my situations better. And as an athlete, um, I gained at least a measure of self-respect through that. And but I think mostly I learned that I didn't have to keep my head down anymore. And as human nature has it, the pendulum kind of swings, and it swung pretty far the other way, where I learned I didn't have to take anything off of anybody, and I can control my situations. And when I got out of high school and got on my own, I found myself being in control of almost every room that I was in. Went to college for a year, and there I came into contact with drugs. I had alcohol in my life from the time I was 16, but mostly marijuana, and that it really derailed my life, and I became an addict. But I still maintained control. I was able to keep a job, and in many ways, I felt like I was at the top of my game. And from there, I think that's about all about me, really, in some ways. Just a few more details, though. A month before my 16th birthday, I was involved in a motorcycle accident that was not my fault. This young lady turned in front of me, and I T-boned her car. I was going about 70 miles an hour when the accident started to unfold, and I don't know how slow I got, but I jumped over the handlebars just before impact, but not soon enough, and a handlebar hit my right leg and shattered my femur about halfway between my knee and my hip. And that was a real life changer for me. Number one, I had fantasy dreams of being an athlete in college, and with my knee shattered and my leg broken, that all came to an end. But through that, there was a small settlement, and I used that as a down payment on a house. So and this is where the narrative, I think, of my witness for Christ begins. When I was at Iowa State University, there was a couple guys that witnessed to me, and I gave them the yeah, sure, I believe that. Prayed the sinner's prayer with no real meaning in my heart, but they gave me this little pocket New Testament that I've had ever since. I remember I was 20 years old, and with this house, with this house that I bought, Marisol was living next door, and I met her, and I wanted to date her. The only way she was already a Christian. The only way she would date me is if we went to church, and then I could take her out to dinner, and that was the extent of our dates initially. This isn't real organized, but so anyway, the point is that through these devastating experiences in my life with the motorcycle accident and things like that caused me to live in that house. And Marisol, when she was living in Barcelona, Spain, she met and married an American sailor. They moved to, after he got out of the Navy, they moved to Jacksonville, Florida. They were married for a time, and through his unfaithfulness, their marriage ended. While they were living in Jacksonville, her sister came over and visited and met and married an American sailor from my hometown, Fort Dodge, Iowa. Well, when Mary saw and her first husband, when they split, she went and she came to Fort Dodge and was living with her sister. Ended up getting it. Oh, and there were my two sons, Mark and Carlos, are from her first marriage. I adopted them when we got married. And she got a job and was renting a house next door to the house that I was living in. And I'm going to kind of wrap this up a little later, in that God used some very devastating experiences in both of our lives to bring us together. Otherwise, there was no way that I would have ever met her apart from God's providence. And I'm going to use that a little bit later. At least I'm planning on it. Who knows where this is going to go for sure. But we went to the church that I'd gone to when I was a kid, and got in and out. It was a big church. No, I don't remember anybody even saying hi to us other than the pastor who was at the door when we left. There was an evangelical free church in Fort Dodge that was starting a Christian school, and Mary Saul wanted the boys to go to that, and we visited that church. I remember still to this day, 43 years later, I don't remember the particulars of the sermon. I don't know what verses he used. I just remember that preacher telling me that I was going to hell. You know, Pastor Gonzalez was not a fire and brimstone preacher, but he preached the word without apology, and the Holy Spirit used him in a mighty way. And I became angry. I'd walked into that church that day thinking I was at the top of my game. 20 years old, had a pretty girlfriend, and I walked out in many ways, or at least some ways, devastated. And I told myself I'm never going back there again. But I did. Pastor Gonzalez faithfully preached the word, verse by verse. And I'd always been a reader from little on. And I read my Bible. I had a job at United States Gypsum. It was a sheetrock factory. I was on the board line. I was a forklift operator. I was working the graveyard shift. About 4 o'clock in the morning, was reading in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23. The account where they had arrested Jesus. Earlier that night, Jesus had told Peter, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And the Gospel of Luke has an interesting detail to it that the other 3 Gospels don't. That when Peter denied Jesus a 3rd time, it says that Peter turned and Jesus turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered and went out and wept bitterly. That night, reading the scripture, I met Jesus for the first time. In my soul, I had a vision of Jesus turning and looking at me, where I'd given him lip service at numerous times in my life, but I was denying him by the way I was living. I got down off the forklift and got on my knees and prayed and was saved. and life has never been the same since. It's not always been perfect, and I'm not perfect. But life has never, ever been the same since. Marisol and I were married shortly, within a year after that. And life was good. I mean, it was hard, but it was good. We were young. Marisol's health took a turn for the worse by the time I was about in my mid 30s. And the doctor told us we needed to move to a different climate. And my employer, United States Gypsum, had a plant in Empire, Nevada. And we moved there and really walked away from a lot of things. I mean, I owned my home. We had a good church. By then, the boys had graduated high school and they were in college and had graduated. And that was a big change. It was a hard move for me to make because I moved away. I mean, it was Marisol and I, and that was awesome, but moved away from the rest of my family, and the rest of my family still lives within 100 miles of where we grew up. But it was there that I think I really began to grow as a Christian. Empire, Nevada was a very interesting place. One of the most heathen places I've ever lived. They were proud and they were arrogant that it was by and large a godless place. There was a small group of believers there, a Southern Baptist church, as a matter of fact. And we started going to church there. And I think God, I know that God, it all worked out. It was all part of God's plan. But Marisol and I both, our faith grew there in very, very dramatic ways. I'd begun teaching in the Evangelical Free Church back in Iowa. I've never been one to seek out positions of leadership. And even right now, I'm very uncomfortable, even though I'm sitting here at home in front of the computer, just public speaking. I always feel ill at ease in many ways, but I've been in leadership positions in our church in Fort Dodge. And I never sought them out when we were in Nevada either. But our pastor had me begin to teach and beginning to preach. And it just drove me into the word even more than I'd ever been before. Life in Empire in many ways was very hard. There was a good group of believers there. And we'd experienced a number of mountaintops. After I was saved, and you know what, I meant to say this, but I didn't. That night, the night that I got saved, reading that passage in Luke, from that point on, God's word has been alive to me. Up until that point, it had just been ink and paper. But from that time on, God's word speaks to my soul. Now, I can't say that it's just this awesome experience every time I read the Bible, because it's not. But I think that's on me when it's not. God speaks. And Marisol and getting to know God through reading the word. Shortly after Marisol and I were married, there was an overnight thing at the church. I was working the graveyard shift, and I went to pick up our boys in the morning. And our son Mark had fallen playing basketball, just being stupid teenage kids, and he hit his head on the floor. And they'd laid him down, and he wasn't feeling well. I took him home and put him on the couch, turned on the TV, and I got cleaned up and I went to bed. And I got up in the afternoon, and he was still sleeping on the couch, and I woke him up and had a hard time waking him up. We took him to the hospital, and they'd done some imaging, and they said that he had something called a subdural hematoma on a very sensitive part of his brain. And they were very concerned. They made some phone calls, and Mark was put in an ambulance. And I knew that I'd gone to school with the guy who was the ambulance driver, and he let me ride in the front of the ambulance, which was definitely not protocol, but since I knew him, he let me do it. And we ended up at Iowa Methodist Hospital in Des Moines. And they took some more, I don't know exactly what the images were they were x-rays or MRIs. Keep in mind, this was in the early 80s. And they confirmed what the doctors in Fort Dodge had said, that it was not good. They had him in intensive care, and they just wanted to observe some things. And they were saying they were going to take some more images in a few days. And that if it hadn't gotten any worse, they would just let it go and hope for the best. But if it stayed the same or had gotten worse, that they would have to do surgery, but they were not positive about that. I remember the elders of our church and our pastor came and prayed. And when they took those images a few days later, it was gone. God had healed my son. When we lived in Empire, Nevada, we witnessed some other pretty amazing things too. I just made some notes here just so I wouldn't forget what some of them were, not any details, just things, episodes, so I wouldn't forget. Another one in Fort Dodge, there was a young lady, a girl the same age as our sons. Her name was Christine Gonzalez. She was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma, and the doctors told her she was dying. We came together and prayed and laid hands on her, and she was healed, and she's alive today. There was a young girl, maybe 4 years old, in Empire, Nevada, who'd been sick for a while and was just weak and sick to her stomach, throwing up all the time. And her parents had taken her into Reno, and they'd run some tests and took some x-rays or MRIs, and there was a spot on her brain. And they told her that they needed to consult with some other doctors and to come back in a few days, and they would figure out a game plan. It was a young couple. They were scared. They came over to Marisol and I's house and asked us to pray. And I said, I would like very much to pray over your daughter. They said, she's too sick to come here. I said, okay, well, let's go over to your house. We prayed. I left. I came home. Got a call from Paul, her dad. So they put her back to bed. And about a half an hour after I'd left, that her daughter came out of the bedroom running around, yelling like a little crazy person, kicked her dad in the shin, and they said, our daughter is back. That little girl. And then when they went to Reno for their other tests, the doctors couldn't explain it. That everything they saw before was gone, and but God had performed a miracle. My life as a Christian has not been all mountaintops. There are some very, very dark times as well. Another time in Empire, Nevada, there was a man in the church who was a leader in the church, and he was well respected in the community. And his mother came to our house saying that their daughter had been molested by this guy. I went and I spoke with him. He initially admitted to it and tried to blame her. And she was like about maybe 12, 13. Then his wife started freaking out, and I was asked to leave. I notified law enforcement, and a few months later they came and arrested him. You know, and the thing is that church, our church was growing. It was it was a small church, but it was full. From the day Brad was arrested, most of the people just totally abandoned the church. People who'd been my friends slapped me on the back. We were pals, wouldn't even talk to me. I remember, but one thing I do remember, that night when I went home from his house, I just felt this overwhelming dread and fear. I believe that, looking back on it, that was a very real satanic attack. Trying to prevent me from contacting law enforcement. But this girl and her mother, they needed justice. He entered into a plea bargain agreement where he was supposed to do no time. But when it got to court, the judge put him in prison. I remember walking out of the courtroom that day, confronted by a man being cursed at. So it's not all been mountaintops. But, that's just the way life is. Young lady, when we moved to Empire, Erica Hernandez, she had muscular dystrophy. Prayed with that girl, I don't know how many times. She reminded me of this. At times I told her where people had been prayed for and they were healed. And she asked for healing as well. But God didn't see fit. Erica remained sick. I remember we were in Reno celebrating Nolan graduating kindergarten. And we'd Marisol had called in to get a hotel room. And when they found out why we were there, they gave us this deal where we had, I don't know what the suite they called it, but it had this double jacuzzi in it. And this was just an amazing room. Nolan was using it for a slip and slide. You'll get it half full of water and slide into it. And while we were there, we got a call from Manny Hernandez, Erica's dad. Erica had died. And Marisol and I, we were contemplating what to do. Nolan said we had to go home. So we did. And we got back, we went to their house. And Nolan insisted on going in to see Erica because they'd been good friends. And I was kind of afraid or concerned about letting him go in and see her body or see her. But he insisted on going in because he was his friend. And when we were there, he said, Erica's not here. She's in heaven. Bittersweet memories. I guess, and then we ended up that was toward the end of the time we were there when that whole molestation thing took place, and God called us to leave, and we moved to California and became involved with First Baptist. Shortly after we moved, the plant closed down, and Empire was a ghost town. I believe, I'm convinced in a very real way that that town, for the most part, rejected God's witness, because God, and it wasn't me, but it was Him working through that church. They'd seen God's power, and they rejected it. And I believe God shut that place down. We moved to California, became involved with Fair Oaks, and now with OneLife. I guess just wrapping up, I wanted the focus of most of what I said tonight to be a testimony about who God is. He is a miracle working God. He loves us. And as I look back on my life, God used very difficult and painful circumstances to work out good. Romans 8:28 is true. I am convinced. I am convinced that this entire Bible is true from beginning to end. Since early on here in Empire, in Sacramento, I've been a Sunday school teacher. I was never any of your Sunday school teachers, but I think like Joel and Andrew, you were maybe had just gotten into junior high when Marisol and I moved there, and I had 5th and 6th grade. And I've been, one of my driving things is to teach so that everyone that I come in contact with knows that God is real and the Bible is true. I try very hard not to say talking about things in the Bible as Bible stories. There are stories in the Bible, but they're true stories. But I always like to teach that there are no stories in the Bible because it's true. I remember a group of junior high girls when Jeff was preaching one time when we were still in the community center. He was talking about a Bible story, and there was a collective gasp from that front corner of the room. And, and he goes, "What? And there's no stories in the Bible." And yeah, Jeff goes, "Yeah, I know. Mr. Matt says there's no stories in the Bible. The Bible is true." You know what? If we come to grips with God is real and this Bible is true, many of our battles are already won because we have a foundation under us. I don't know for sure all the details what the future is going to hold, but I am convinced that if we will keep our eyes on God and serve Him, He will work miracles in our midst. As OneLife Church, we've been through some difficult times in the past couple of years. But I am amazed by all of you, how faithful you've been, keeping your eyes on Jesus. I don't know what He's going to do. I don't know how everything's going to work out. But I do know that God is in control. He causes all things to work together for good to those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. And it is a privilege to serve with you because I believe collectively we are committed to, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Thank you for your time tonight.